Hey guys, Dave here with an initial look at Project Cars 2 on consoles. Here I'll be taking a look at the game running on PS4 Pro, base PS4, Xbox One and even Xbox One S, as we find out whether performance has been improved over the original game and what other tweaks have been made, whether that be in terms of resolution and visual and gameplay features. To start, Project Cars 2 represents a refinement over the original game in several areas. For example, the real-time weather system has been upgraded with the introduction of a brand new snow season, which deposits snow across the environment, along with the option to actually have varying degrees of snowfall, from a light flutter to a complete blizzard. And this not only impacts upon the actual visual presentation, but also on the gameplay, changing the car handling as the tyres cool down with the shifts in temperature. As to be expected, the introduction of snow will work with all the other dynamic weather elements, so you can select 4 different weather changes across the course of a race. In addition to that, there are also some other various technical changes running behind the scenes in order to enhance the gameplay and handling on offer. For example, Project Cars 2 uses variances in temperature, altitude and other atmospheric conditions to change how your car performs in different circumstances. This definitely adds a more dynamic edge to the gameplay in Project Cars 2 over the original game, particularly when we're looking at shifting weather conditions during a race. Project Cars 2 also upgrades the wet weather conditions as well, via the use of fluid dynamics. So for example, if you're driving in a rainstorm, the track conditions react a bit more like they would in the real world. When the rain is pouring down, puddles of water start building up across the ground as the track can't absorb the water fast enough. So there's some pretty impressive upgrades here, and some of these features are ones that you don't normally find in a 60 FPS title. In fact, you usually expect them in games like Forza Horizon 3 or Drive Club, games that target 30 frames per second. But Slightly Mad have managed to implement them in a game targeting 60 FPS. Now in terms of the quality across consoles, this naturally varies. The more powerful hardware does deliver a more stable, more consistent experience. So far we've been showing off the game running on PlayStation 4 Pro, and that's basically where I'll begin. Unlike Project Cars 1, which didn't support the Pro at all, other than say using boost mode to improve frame rates or get them closer to 60 FPS, Project Cars 2 does have full PS4 Pro support. So there is a resolution bump over 1080p. We're looking at between 1360 and 1440p depending what's going on. Usually in wet weather or stormy conditions where the engine is more under load, we get lower metrics around 1360p, whereas on a bright sunshiny clear day, or even at the start of a busy race, 1440p is often seen. This means that we don't always get a large upgrade over native 1080p, and when viewing on a 4K display, it's fair to say that the upscaling artifacts on the dynamic resolution presentation going up to 1440p means that things look a little rougher than they perhaps should do. There's a sense that perhaps playing on PS4 Pro on a full HD set with 1:1 pixel mapping gives us the best image quality on consoles. Of course, using the dynamic resolution and limiting resolution to 1440p rather than pushing things higher is done for a reason: performance. Project Cars 2 is a game targeting 60 frames per second, and really it's important to make sure that the frame rate is pretty consistent here. After all, you don't want variances in controller response and things like judder interrupting on the race, and for the most part the PS4 Pro does a really good job here. In general racing conditions with around 16 cars without any kind of rain or snow, then the game holds to its 60 FPS target really nicely. It's a solid experience that feels good to play and looks great too. There's something about the extra temporal resolution that a solid 60 FPS provides that makes running at this frame rate so enjoyable. You really get to appreciate more of the finer details on screen, along with the improved gameplay of course. Really, performance is only impacted on PS4 Pro in heavy stress tests. That's with the full quota of 32 cars on screen with demanding weather conditions, such as a full-blown thunderstorm. Here the game still holds very closely to its 60 FPS target. In fact, the frame rate really drops below, 59 FPS, it's always borderline. So that aspect of the game really isn't an issue. However, Slightly Mad has implemented adaptive VSync here. So basically we do get plenty of screen tearing when performance is being impacted. Take away the rain though, and the impact here is more limited. Heavy tearing appears at the beginning of the race, but as soon as we get settled in and the cars start to disperse, we're back to a 60 FPS lock again. So overall, in terms of pro performance, it's generally excellent. It's only really when we're faced with extremely demanding conditions that the engine gets hit. Obviously resolution is sacrificed here in order to maintain 60 FPS, which is a bit of a disappointment, but it's kind of the right choice for gameplay. And if you've got a full HD screen, then it's really not a problem. Moving on to base PS4, and yes, there's an adaptive resolution in play also. The original Project Cars operates at a fixed 1080p on base hardware, but with this sequel, we're looking at anywhere between 1080 and 864p here. We get native 1080p to start, basically in less demanding scenes with around 15 cars and clear weather conditions, so we get crisp 1:1 pixel mapping on a full HD display. But in terms of stress tests, then resolution can vary, with the resolution dynamically adjusting depending on the rendering load. Usually it's heavy use of alpha effects such as rainfall and particles that really start to impact performance, along with having lots of cars on screen as well. This means image quality isn't quite as consistent as the first Project Cars, but given the fact that Slightly Mad have introduced a bunch of extra rendering features, then it kind of makes sense to incorporate dynamic res in order to better hit 60 frames per second. So, have they managed to do it? Well, overall performance here is very similar to the first Project Cars. With about 16 cars on screen, we get a mostly locked 60 frames per second, but in areas where the cars are bunched up and there tends to be a bit of smoke or particles effects on screen, then we do get a lowering of performance, with a few frame rate drops and the introduction of screen tearing. But really it's not too bad here, and we're mostly getting that 60 FPS experience we want, at least with sort of clean daytime conditions. It's only when we start introducing wet weather and snow where performance starts dropping. It's here where the game really struggles to get 60 frames per second, and there's a sense that it doesn't look or feel quite as smooth to play. There's not really an improvement here over the first Project Cars in terms of how well the game runs. So it's pretty much what you'd expect here. Moving on to the stress test on the Azure circuit, and performance remains in line with the original game. We're looking at around 40, 45, even up to 50 FPS here, but with constant screen tearing. It's fair to say that these moments aren't the best way to play Project Cars 2. There's a lot of stutter on screen which can be quite distracting. Although if you look at the frame time graph, you'll notice that controller response actually holds up very well and there's very little difference from the game running at a solid 60 FPS. The introduction of adaptive VSync really helps here, and it's really just the kind of annoying screen wobble and drop in smoothness that impacts upon the race. So in terms of PS4, well, image quality takes a step down from the original game due to the dynamic resolution, but performance is very similar and you do get additional graphical features, so it's kind of a balanced approach to optimizing on the platform. One thing that's worth noting though is that replays are now capped to 30 frames per second across all platforms, and that's regardless of what camera you're using. Switch to the chase cam for example and you're still only getting a 30 FPS replay, not the 60 FPS you'd normally get during gameplay. On one hand it's a little bit disappointing given that it is possible to get 60 FPS during gameplay, but on the other it's quite understandable because performance can vary under demanding conditions, and indeed the trackside replay camera tends to be more demanding than say the chase cam during gameplay. In that sense it kind of makes sense that frame rates were capped at 30 FPS, allowing for a degree of consistency when switching between viewpoints. The only issue we noted here is the introduction of improper frame pacing at times, leading to stutter in areas where frame rates are perfectly smooth. But given that performance is always above 30 frames per second, then this is something that could easily be fixed via a future patch. Lastly, we move on to the Xbox One, and this was the console that really didn't fare so well when it came to the original Project Cars. With regards to the sequel, again, dynamic resolution here with anything between 864p up to 972p. So image quality in less demanding scenes takes a slight hit to PS4, but during stress tests or when the engine is under load, really there isn't much of a difference here. We're looking at similar low points in resolution during rainfall and stormy conditions. Elsewhere, PS4 still has the advantage though, giving the game a slightly more refined look on Sony's platform, which allows it to hold up better on both 1080p and 4K screens. There's a sense that image quality is more variable than the original Project Cars, due to the use of the dynamic resolution, although graphical quality is upgraded in other areas with new effects work. Performance is another aspect that's changed on Xbox One as well. We're going to kick off with a stress test here. Yep, the Azure circuit once again. And in the original Project Cars, even after several patches, frame rates could still dip down to 30 FPS here with constant screen tearing. But with Project Cars 2, Slightly Mad Studios has managed to improve things. No, it's not a locked 60 FPS or anywhere close to. That simply wouldn't be possible given the sheer demands on the GPU and indeed the CPU here, with all the visual effects and physics heavy calculations going on. But instead, drops only go down to around 40 FPS and venture up into the low 50s. So in this respect, we're looking at an experience that is pretty much in line with what we're getting on PlayStation 4 in these kind of situations. Of course, it's worth bearing in mind that performance can vary dramatically, depending on what track you choose, the number of cars and the weather conditions. And Project Cars 2 on the Xbox One isn't immune to dips into the 30s. This particular sequence here demonstrates this well. There's only 16 cars here, but switching to this bumper viewpoint seems to impact performance a little more heavily. Perhaps because the alpha effects take up more of the screen, thus pushing bandwidth limits even harder. Again, it's not great, but it's worth bearing in mind this is a demanding stress test, and the only console that this really runs smoothly on is PlayStation 4 Pro, albeit with some screen tearing at the beginning of the race. So it's not quite ideal, but it's kind of expected. Unfortunately, if there's one area where the Xbox One version does fall short, it's in terms of performance during regular racing. Unlike the base PS4, which can hit 60 FPS pretty often under clear racing conditions, on Xbox One the game frequently struggles to hit that target. We're looking at constant screen tearing here, along with a highly variable frame rate that falls short of 60 frames per second, and that means that we're not getting the kind of consistency we want. The game can of course appear pretty smooth at times, but there is that screen wobble that can be distracting. Ultimately, it looks like the slower GPU is kind of the issue here on Xbox One, and I guess we're going to have to wait for the One X in order to get that locked 60 FPS experience on Microsoft's console, or at least something very closely approaching that. The Xbox One S could potentially give us a boost, but when we tested the Azure circuit stress test, well, performance was very much the same, with variances simply coming down to the gameplay not matching up exactly. So we've covered all three versions of Project Cars 2, and well, how does it stack up? We'll leave the more in-depth graphical comparisons for later, but in terms of the basics, it's pretty clear. If you want the definitive Project Cars experience on console at the moment, the one that gives you that 60 FPS experience, then the PlayStation 4 Pro version is the way to go here. Yeah, you're not getting a massive resolution boost if you own a 4K TV, but you are getting a closer lock to 60 FPS. It's only the introduction of heavy tearing during the stress tests that otherwise impact on the experience. Aside from that, it's a great game to play on the Pro. In terms of the base consoles, PS4 once again takes the lead here, and actually performs very well outside of stress tests. The game does a decent job of delivering its 60 FPS promise when there's say half a quota of cars on screen without rainy or stormy conditions. Whereas on Xbox One, well, it's fair to say the game doesn't really do a good job at hitting 60 FPS, and there's the sense that the hardware here isn't really quite up to the job. I mean, the experience is still playable, but it's kind of far from ideal with the constant screen wobble and stuttering that you get. Overall then, it's been kind of interesting. Slightly Mad Studios has implemented a dynamic resolution in order to help maintain that 60 FPS target across all platforms, perhaps as a way of allowing the inclusion of more advanced effects we usually only see on 30 FPS games. The There's a sense that the underlying simulation behind the game is more complex than the original title, and yet performance is generally very similar. We get a slight impact to image quality consistency, but other than that, if you've played the first Project Cars, then you kind of know what to expect with this sequel. And there's a sense that any limitations here are simply down to the fact that the current console hardware is getting a bit old with regards to the base PS4 and Xbox One. But PS4 Pro does a very good job here, and it's likely the Xbox One X will also hand in a very good experience too, but we'll have to wait and see for that. Anyway, with that said, I think I'll leave it there. I hope you enjoyed our look at Project Cars 2, and if you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. Also be sure to check this video out on our Patreon and support us by subscribing there, where you'll get to see the high quality encode that really showcases the benefit of 60 frames per second. But anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.